Well, thanks very much for coming. And you will have gathered my main thesis is that society isn't going to make any progress unless it takes seriously the need to believe in some kind of God. And I'm going to try and explain this. I'm arguing that 300 years of secular theory have left modern Western society unable to solve our biggest problems. We are destroying the environment that we depend on. For 40 years, the rich have been getting richer and the poor poorer. Western powers, including Britain, have been dropping so many bombs on other countries for so long that we have learnt to take it for granted. Environmental destruction, poverty, war. In each case, the most powerful governments, including Britain, know the situation is getting worse, know we need to change direction, go to conferences making speeches about the need to do something, but actually carry on making them worse. So that's my concern. All this is well known. There's mountains of statistics on all these. My thesis is that our inability to improve things results from the basic principle of secular society. And what I mean by that, I'm just going to give you, this is a very rough indication of what I'm talking about here. Secular society began 300 years ago as a way of establishing peace after the religious wars. Those wars were driven by two incompatible beliefs. Governments believed that the state would flourish only if the population engaged in correct worship. Now, that idea was thousands of years old. But individuals also believed, and this was the newer thing, that they would only avoid eternal punishment in hell if they worshipped correctly. So if you disagree with your government, it's better to be burnt at the stake than to go to the wrong church. The secular solution was to treat afterlife salvation as the only reason for religious belief and worship. Religious beliefs were to be otherworldly, unverifiable, private opinions of individuals, whereas society needed to be run on verifiable public facts. So secular theory tells us that all questions are to be solved, all public questions are to be solved by secular reason and science without reference to any religious beliefs. My claim is that today, rather than helping us to solve our biggest problems, it stops us solving them. That's what I'm claiming. And there are two main reasons. One is that if everything has to be based on public verification, somebody has to decide what is worth verifying and what to ignore. The other is that secular reason and science don't tell us which values to adopt. So my position basically is that God is the only adequate basis for ethics, and what's more, a particular kind of God, the God which we usually refer to as monotheism. One God, what matters about God's oneness is unity of will, not unity of person. Divine harmony, I'm going to call it. So, I'm not rejecting the Trinity, angels, the divinity of Christ. I'm quite happy with them, but I do reject the devil. So if the devil is here in this church, I am sorry, you will just have to get used to your non-existence. So, to clarify what's at stake, what I'm going to do is first contrast divine harmony with the divine conflict characteristic of ancient polytheist faiths. And that'll establish a model for then comparing it with the divine absence of secular theory. So, going back in time. I'm going to just change something on this machine for a minute. That should do. Right. As far back as we can go in history, in every society that anthropologists have studied, our hunter-gatherer ancestors knew they depended on natural forces outside their control. They thought those forces were agents with personalities and intentions, gods. Why? Well, imagine what it would be like if Liverpool was invaded by foreigners who take over control and enslave us all. They will need to find out where everything is, how it works, and how they can make us do what they want. We, on the other hand, will need to cope with the new situation. We must learn to live with these invaders. My mother spent the Second World War in a house in Athens with a German officer stationed in the house. It's a different feel. So, if you're invaded, what are these invaders like? How can we persuade them to be gentle with us? How can we find their weak points? So, the winners need knowledge for control, the losers need knowledge for relationship. That's the difference. Modern Westerners think we can control the world around us. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors knew they couldn't. So they thought in terms of relating to the forces around them, praying, sacrificing, thanking. With the rise of agriculture, populations grew. If you live in a city, your main threats don't come from the forces of nature. They come from other people, don't they? The government, the mayor, your employer, your boss, the local burglars. So the divine agents associated with natural forces gradually took on different personalities. Ancient versions of soap operas. Pantheons of gods quarrelling with each other, having affairs with each other, and meanwhile maintaining the world and expecting us all to offer them sacrifices. An extreme example is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The gods fought on both sides in the Trojan War. You really wouldn't want the world to be governed by gods like that. It would have been total chaos. Yet for classical Greece, these texts were the classic texts, the nearest thing they had to Holy Scripture. Right, what does that mean? Divine conflict, polytheism. Two things to draw out from this. By explaining human suffering and tragedy as results of divine activity, they make it seem inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. Life is tragic. That's why the Greek tragedies were tragedies. Secondly, if the natural environment is maintained by independent, self-willed gods, each deciding for themselves what to do, the future is completely unpredictable. Science would have been absolutely impossible on that basis. Right, so, but is monotheism any better? Here's a much quoted text. Given that monotheism is the traditional basis, one God is the traditional basis for the Jewish, Christian and Islamic faiths, why is it so unpopular? Theologians distinguish between monotheism from above and monotheism from below. So here we are. This is one approach. At the height of the Cold War, American political discourse presented the American cause as Christian. I guess most of you remember that. So here's the feminist, American feminist theologian Carter Haywood. This cold deity is the legitimating construct of the patriarchal desire to dominate and control the world. He is the eternal king, the chairman of the board, the president of the institution, the guru of the youth, the husband of the wife, the general of the army, the judge of the court, the master of the universe, the father of the church. He resides above us all. He is our superior, never our friend. He is a rapist, never a lover of women and of anybody else beneath him. He is the first and final icon of evil in history. That italics is hers, not mine. Goes back a long way. It wasn't just the Americans. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, which is basically as far back as we've got enough historical records for, kings would claim to have been appointed by the supreme God to maintain order. Just as they believed their supreme God had defeated divine enemies to establish order and peace, the king's role was to establish order and peace by defeating human enemies. Here's the main troublemaker, Assur, the god of ancient Assyria. The Assyrian texts emphasize this more than any other ancient texts. And the Assyriologist Simo Parpolo has argued that Assyrians were monotheistic from early times, before the Hebrews. This was their chief gods. The other gods were emanations of him. Other scholars disagree. I'm glad they do, because his account of Assyrian theology, his account of their monotheism, is exactly the kind of imperialism, come in, is exactly the kind of imperialism that Carter Haywood was criticizing. Its monotheism is a thin veneer on top of a thoroughly polytheistic substance. The veneer is that there's one God of the whole world, so there should be one king of the whole world. Anyone who resists the king's rule is resisting the supreme God and should be punished. The polytheistic substance is the justification for conquest. The king should defeat other kings because the supreme God became supreme by defeating other gods. Oh, so there were other gods. Assyrian invaders sometimes made a point of destroying the statues of enemy gods because they thought that would deprive their enemies of divine support. It seems crazy to us. They were only painted wooden statues, but, you know, this is the way they were thinking. But it implies that the enemy gods were real enough. Well, this polytheism, dressed up as monotheism, has echoed through the ages. Constantine is an obvious example, right? Westerners today who defend the massive military arsenal by appealing to the Christian God are making exactly the same mistake. If there really is only one God, then there cannot be a divine model for fighting. North Koreans are God's children just as much as Americans are. Not even Donald Trump has been appointed by God to police the world. Right, that's monotheism from above. I'm now going to turn to what they call monotheism from below. This expresses the view of the oppressed and defeated. History is usually written by the winners. The losers need to believe there is a moral authority higher than the ruling classes who are oppressing you. That's fairly obvious, isn't it? Yeah? It's the logic behind the claim that monotheism is to be found in the Bible. It's not straightforward. Plenty of biblical texts sound pretty polytheistic, and scholars debate when monotheism first appears. Nevertheless, when the Hebrew scriptures are compared with other ancient Near Eastern texts, we hear the voice of the losers appealing to a supreme divine authority above the winners, above the gods of the winners. And that's the point. So here's John Barton. Israelite ethics rests on an optimistic anthropology in which the human race is created as something good and is seen as capable of living in fellowship with God, whereas in Mesopotamia the creation of humans is an aspect of the chaotic in the world. Israelite anthropology inevitably leads to a different way of thinking about society and about moral norms. Scholars sometimes contrast the first chapter of Genesis with the creation story of ancient Babylon, where the supreme god was called Marduk. The story describes how the gods fight each other. Eventually Marduk wins, and to keep the other gods happy, he has a plan. He creates a new kind of being to do the housekeeping so that the gods don't have to work so hard. Humans. Our job is to maintain temples and burn sacrifices. Whenever we fail, we can be punished with plagues or floods, and that happens quite often. But if the worst comes to the worst, the project can be cancelled and the world can revert to the original chaos. It may be that the first chapter of Genesis is partly a reaction against that story. In the Babylonian system, no god has complete power. In Genesis, one God has complete power. So what gets created is what God wanted. In the Babylonian system, gods can deceive each other. In Genesis, the one God can in principle know everything, so God's plans are going to work. In the Babylonian system, the world order is the product of divine conflict. It could change if another god overcomes Marduk, or Marduk changes his mind, so there remains the threat of chaos. In Genesis, God's world order is absolutely secure. In the Babylonian system, humans are created to serve the gods in specific ways. What happens to us the rest of the time doesn't concern them. In Genesis, God doesn't need anything from us. We are created for our own sakes as a blessing. And Mark Smith, one of his books, he stresses that Genesis is still the only ancient Near Eastern text that describes the creation of the world as a blessing for humans. So how does the God of Genesis account for all the evil and suffering in the world? Now, I read the second and third chapters of Genesis as an answer to this question, and the answer is basically the classic free will defense. God withdraws from complete power so as to give us freedom, and so we have the potential, if we so choose, to become holy like God. Whereas divine conflict tells us there's nothing we can do about evil, divine harmony says there is. It offers us hope. The downside is we are responsible. So, what we get, although the Bible doesn't put it like this, is the omnipotent, omniscient, and good God, complete power, knowledge, and goodness. And part of its goodness is that we can progress towards holiness because we are free to choose between good and evil. I'm just going to finish this section now by explaining some of the monotheistic themes that differ from polytheism. Humanity as a unity. Polytheists could believe that each nation had been created by its own God. In that case, are foreigners humans like us, or should we treat them like dogs? Or will they treat us like dogs? You know, all that sort. That was possibility. The idea of humanity as a whole was known before, but Christianity gave it greater substance by claiming that everybody in the world is created as an act of blessing by the same God. Foreigners are God's children, created to be blessed just like us. This is the origin of the equality discourse that we still have today. This is where it comes from. Linear time. Ancient polytheists conceive of time in different ways. Monotheism expects that God's intentions are worked out. God's plans aren't going to be messed up. God isn't going to change her mind. The world order isn't going to be interrupted. So we take it for granted today, but it was monotheism that gave it to us. Progress. In monotheism, the foundation for ethics is a good world with potential for improvement. If the world isn't good in the first place, we are stuck with tragedy. If there's no potential for improvement, this is as good as it gets. God provides us with what we need to know to grow into holiness. So again, it was monotheism that gave Europe its belief in progress. Right, that's the first part. Have you followed so far? Does it kind of make sense? I now want to ask what happens to those differences if either there are no gods at all, or what I want to focus on, the secular principle, that even if there are any gods, public life has to operate without taking them into account. The secular principle. Right, so to introduce the difference, I'm going to take you to visit some friends. And when we arrive, you give a present to the little girl. Some crayons and drawing paper. Her parents ask her, "What do you say?" She ignores them, she's too busy for that. She starts drawing. A few minutes later, she comes back to you and she says, "Here, this is for you." It's a picture of you sitting on the toilet. Now, you tell me, how are you going to respond?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. That's
Yeah. You are, aren't you?
Yeah, something nice and insincere.
Yes. And would it really be insincere? Would you have been equally happy if she'd ignored it?
No. No, it wouldn't be insincere, you know, I would say that's a lovely picture and that would be insincere, but
yeah.
the pleasure of getting given a thoughtful
right.
thing like that, yeah, you're right, that wouldn't be insincere.
Yeah, okay. So giving you the drawing is every child's natural way of expressing gratitude. And your grateful response is how positive relationships build up. Gratitude for gratitude. It was me who suggested the crayons and drawing paper, but you could have given her a syringe and some heroin. Why not? Pardon? She'd harm herself. She trusts you as an adult. Right? So, not only is there gratitude, but there's trust.
And responsibility.
Responsibility. Thank you. This drawing was in fact done by my 3-year-old daughter Abigail, and it's a picture of her grandma who has just broken a bone, so she couldn't be here tonight. But if you know Marguerite, you can judge for yourself how accurate the picture is.
That's on that one, John.
Right, now let's change the story. You are one of the child's parents, and she turns up with some crayons and drawing paper, and you say, "Where did you get them from?" And she says, "Oh, they were in a pile of rubbish on the pavement." Now what do you say? What are you going to say?
That issue a compliment on her recycling and planting skills.
Right, thank you.
I think you'd be a bit worried about her picking stuff up from rubbish on paper.
You'd be worried about picking, right, so let's spell out why you're worried. What might go wrong?
There can be anything out there. And,
Right.
you know, we teach our children to be very selective and
Right.
careful about what they pick up from
Right,
other
okay.
than ourselves and close friends and relatives.
It would depend which of my children it was. If it was my daughter, I'd say, "Oh, how lucky. Wonderful." If it was my son, I'd be a bit suspicious that he'd actually pinched it.
If the child can find something what is used for his or her creativity,
Mm-hmm.
cannot be wrong.
Cannot be wrong, right. You're thinking...
Is selective by that fact that takes what is good and makes something even better because it's creative.
Right, okay. Yeah.
In London, if they don't want and need anything, they leave it out for people to help themselves.
Right, that's good.
Even we should encourage that you
Encourage it, yeah.
encourage to be selective in
Right.
this way. Bravo that you brave you have found the...
So you're not concerned about the girl hunting around in the rubbish?
Basically no, because that's what was creative, what didn't use in a wrong way, didn't... this means that had learned something good.
Right, okay.
Kids are brilliant, the brave and courageous and the explorer. They should be encouraged to bring stuff home from skips, in my opinion.
So what do you say to this? You were concerned, some of you were concerned about. It's different, isn't it? Yeah, there's nobody to thank and there's nobody to trust. So it's an issue. And that is what I think makes all the difference when secular society excludes God from its public decision making. We have nobody to thank and nobody to trust. We happen to be here as a result of physical matter obeying impersonal laws of nature. Nothing is intended. The world isn't designed for us. Nobody controls it. Maybe a meteor is about to split our planet in half next week. Maybe global warming was going to kill us all off anyway. We'd better take control. We'd be crazy not to in those circumstances. We are the only beings with minds capable of controlling what goes on. So, secular society sets out to grab for itself the omnipotence, omniscience and goodness which previously were attributed to God. So what happens? Well, human omnipotence is, we know about, that's Francis Bacon there. When environmental philosophers lament our destructiveness, they usually point to a change in European attitudes round about 400 years ago. Francis Bacon inverted Augustine's doctrine of the fall. Right. For Augustine, when Adam and Eve ate the apple, the forbidden fruit, it doesn't tell you that. When Adam and Eve ate this thing, they made humanity sinful, but nature carried on unaffected. For Francis Bacon, the fall spoilt nature, but humanity still had the power to recreate the original perfection by means of science and technology. Take God out of Bacon's theory and we lose the idea of re-establishing the original perfection. We've retained the idea of progress, but there's no longer an end point. We don't have the foggiest idea what we're trying to progress towards, so we focus on means rather than ends. Progress is no longer about spiritual and moral improvement, instead it's about new science and technology for their own sakes. So, we're constantly excited by the latest inventions while destroying wildlife incomparably more intricate and essential. Sun and rain, photosynthesis, pollination are just accidental products of unthinking, impersonal laws of nature. But the latest mobile phone is a triumph of technology, and billions are spent advertising it. Thus we have driven to extinction the greatest number of species since the age of the dinosaurs, and we're bequeathing to future generations a world artificially hot, artificially polluted, and full of stuff our descendants will wonder why we wanted it. Human omniscience, I apologise for the poor drawing, it was the best I could do. In order to control the world, we need to know how it works. We need two acts of faith. That everything is in principle predictable, and that the human mind is capable of doing the predicting. So Descartes described reality as two spheres, pictured on the left there. In the physical world, the one at the bottom, everything is determined, atoms pushing each other, cause and effect. Everything there is opened to inspection by the human mind. There are no unobservables. In the spiritual realm above, the human mind relates to God and does its knowing. You may not have known that your mind looks like an electric light bulb. But please note, it has to be the old-fashioned sort, the ones that give out more heat than light. A century later, atheists abolished the spiritual realm. Everything is matter. So where do we locate the human mind? It must be a product of physical matter. People's thoughts are caused by brain processes. So, science should enable us not only to control the physical world, but also to control people. The greatest exponent of this idea was the Frenchman Auguste Comte, who founded both sociology and the positivist philosophy. As befitted someone who believed the human mind was determined, Comte had no time for democracy. The country should be governed by the people who know how people behave, and that is sociologists. So, if there are any sociologists here, that's your cue for taking over the world. We call it social engineering. We, the enlightened elite, know the laws governing human behavior. We can run society so as to manipulate people's behavior for their own good. The tradition starts with intellectuals like Comte and Herbert Spencer, more recently behaviorists and evolutionary biologists. These intellectuals never imposed their theories on whole nations, but Hitler, Stalin and Mao saw the point, set out to make the world a better place by forcing people to fit into their schemes. Hello, come in. Well, what's wrong with this? If all human thoughts are determined, caused, then the thoughts of the social engineers are caused as well, aren't they? If all our thoughts are caused by neurons firing in our brains, which is the way the language works these days, and if the way they fire is caused by something else, which is caused by something else, all the way back to the Big Bang, it would follow that we can never escape from this determined sequence to find out whether anything we have ever believed is true. here's me thinking I'm talking sense. But maybe I really think it because my neurons in my brain make me think it. Maybe this talk of mine is just random nonsense generated by bits of brain. But if you think it's nonsense, you only think it's nonsense because your neurons in your brain are making you think it's nonsense. Ha! Right, that was social engineering. But after Comte came Charles Darwin. This is Patricia Churchland's way of putting the problem. If the human mind has evolved out of something like chimpanzee mind, it has evolved to be very good at a very limited range of activities. It's about moving the body. So, this is the way she puts it. Boiled down to essentials, a nervous system enables the organism to succeed in the 4 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproducing. The principal chore of nervous systems is to get the body parts where they should be in order that the organism may survive. And then she adds, truth, whatever that is, definitely takes the hindmost. Which does make you wonder whether she believed that that statement of hers was true. So, just as taking over God's omnipotence has made us destroy the things we depend on, taking over God's omniscience has left us more ignorant than ever. Now, before we finish, I'll just say something about God's goodness, how we take that over. If there are no gods, only humans, omnibenevolence is the clever way of putting it. Whoops. There it is, that's the one, yeah. If only humans are capable of making moral judgments, and the same applies to all our values can only exist to the extent that humans create them. Now, believers and unbelievers can agree that each of us is born with some values, and as we grow, we acquire others. We do most of it in society, together with other people. There's a constant interplay between what we think and what our friends think, what we pick up from radio, television, newspapers, society, and what's going on in our own minds. So the question at issue is, are we inventing values from scratch? Or are we discovering values that were already there? It makes a bigger difference than we usually realize. Even the most individualist of us imbibe the values of our society, whether or not we know it. Because the dominant voices have the greatest power to influence public opinion, in practice, the dominant values of each society echo the values of the ruling classes. Now, that's pretty obvious. It's always been like that. But it's accentuated when a society believes its ethical debates are about creating values that were not there anyway. It then follows that there are no moral authorities higher than the dominant voices. The dominant values of our society become the right values by definition. It becomes impossible to argue that they're ever wrong. Fascists understand this perfectly well. When we accept its logic, Americans believe the American media, the British believe the British media, Russians believe the Russian media. Each side fills up with righteous indignation, and bombs drop. When we don't accept any moral authority higher than our own ruling classes, we are actually back to the world of Homer's Iliad, with constant conflict between supreme moral authorities. Once again, that conflict between authorities not only explains human conflict, but makes it inevitable. So, treating morality as a human creation suits the powerful and those who identify with them. It means there's no higher authority to tell them they're wrong. Conversely, if you're one of the losers, the oppressed, the destitute, the homeless, the outcast, it's important to know that there are moral standards above Theresa May and Donald Trump. It's important to know that by the highest standards, those people are sometimes wrong. I doubt whether anybody here really believes that the values of Theresa May or Donald Trump are correct by definition. We reserve to ourselves the right to disagree with them. My point is that reserving the right to disagree presupposes that there are higher moral authorities. In other words, we still believe in true values that transcend all humans. Just to take one example, and I'm about to finish. The Manchester bomber. Everybody said what he did was evil. I didn't hear anybody say, I have freely decided to count it as evil. Nor did I hear anybody say, society has decided to count it as evil. The way people responded that it really was evil, over and above what anybody thinks, over and above what society thinks. There are truths. So, my point is that society, for all its apparent secularism, is riddled with appeals to transcendent moral authorities. We no longer call them gods. We've practiced the art of refusing to examine what on earth we mean by them, but we believe they're there, guiding us in how we should live. If we could talk about them more realistically, it would help us to engage constructively with our biggest problems. It wouldn't give immediate answers, but it would give us reason to believe that there are answers. It's only when we believe there are answers that we can work together to find them. So I'm just going to summarize now briefly. When we believe in divine conflict, our trust in the world order is limited. We develop myths of humanity as a whole pitted against the way things are. The priests of ancient Babylon were the experts. They knew how many animals the farmers had to bring for sacrifice. But the real beneficiaries were the priests themselves. The great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity and Islam, all began by liberating people from that. But now we've returned to it. The forces of nature are once again not to be trusted. We don't call them gods now, we call them laws of nature or market forces or the economy. But once again, we are taught the myth of humanity as a whole, pitted against the tragic nature of reality. Once again, we are to put our trust in our experts, do what they tell us, work hard, and make sacrifices to defend ourselves against chaos. It therefore makes a huge difference how we conceive of the forces maintaining the universe and our lives. If they are impersonal, unthinking, automatic, then only humans have the capacity to plan and make wise choices. But there are 7 billion of us, and in practice, the decisions are made by the most powerful people, and they're always in conflict with each other. If, on the other hand, the forces maintaining the universe know what they're doing and design our bodies and minds to bless us, then we have reason to trust them and be grateful. We no longer need control. We no longer need endless new technologies and economic growth. We can be less busy. If there is to be that trust and gratitude, there has to be someone to thank. And so, let's just think again. That little girl took the crayons and paper, used them to do something creative, and gave them back as an expression of gratitude. in the same way the first Christians took wheat and grapes, turned them into bread and wine, and said to God, this is for you, it's our Eucharist. And the Greek word Eucharist is usually mistranslated communion or mass. It really means humanity's proper response to our condition. Instead of telling ourselves that the world around us is there by accident and trying to control it, we should once again celebrate it as undeserved gift. So we turn to the giver and offer our Eucharist, which you probably all know anyway. It really means thank you.